Newest 2020 contenders, Governor Jay Inslee, is focusing his presidential campaign on combating climate change. While he's not the only candidate calling for a serious approach to preserving the environment, he is the first to focus solely on the problem.
But is climate change really a threat? Are we heading for the doomsday that we keep hearing about? According to a study by the CO2 Coalition, it's global food security that is one of the country's most pressing problems. The group also argues that CO2 added to the environment has already greened the planet. Researchers also argue that industrial CO2 will be the difference between food security and food insecurity. To expand on this, we're joined by Dr. Caleb Rossiter, the executive director of the CO2 Coalition. Dr. Rossiter, thank you so much. A lot of attention on this issue right now, not just because of a presidential candidate who is building a campaign around the issue of climate change and how the world might end and we're all going to die.
I mean, these are things
these are things that people say. No, they say that we have 12 years or else the world's actually going to be on a glide path to destruction. And little kids cry about this. And we even had the woman that organized the group that came in here and said that little kids should be crying about this to politicians. It was amazing. That's a whole other discussion, the Sunshine Movement. But Dr. Rossiter, tell me, what are people not getting here?
Costs and benefits are the way we make public policy, and scientists can help you with costs and benefits. We have to balance out what we know about the risks posed by increasing the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere as we have from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million over the last 120 years, and will continue to rise probably to 550 parts per million in the next 30, 40 years. That does a lot of good things for the planet, obviously. Our report about greening the Earth. People spend a lot of money in commercial greenhouses to get carbon dioxide pumped in because it makes plants grow better. That's well-established science. We've got about a 15 to 30% increase so far in plant productivity just because of carbon dioxide. So that's a plus. On the negative side, the Earth has warmed about 1 degree since the year 1900. Now, the first half of that warming cannot come, and it's well-established science, and it's a scientific consensus, cannot come from carbon dioxide. There wasn't enough being pumped in to make a difference by that point. It is a warming gas. But there's been about half a degree warming since 1980. Again, it's hard to say we know all of that is from carbon dioxide. The UN body itself says they're confident that at least half of it is. So you have the possibility that this warming will increase droughts, floods,
extreme weather
sea level rise, extreme weather rise. Now, if I could just, as a statistics professor, just take 1 minute and explain how you do a statistical proof.
Okay,
1 minute.
I love it. Go for it.
Show me this, and I think one foundational question is, we talked off air, the data from the previous 120 years may not apply as we've entered into a new model.
You are a good statistics student. You're absolutely right. Correlation is not causation. Previous behavior is not necessarily predictive. These are important uncertainties. The reason we're healthy today is that the Food and Drug Administration doesn't let you take the drugs you and I took as kids when we got sick, or a vaccine or whatever, until they pass a statistical test. You don't just give a control group no treatment and give the treatment group some drugs, and if one group's a little higher than the other, you say it works, we approve this drug. You have to make sure it didn't happen by chance. And so the standard used in all science is you want to be 95% sure that the result is extremely different, treatment and control group. We know it works because it could happen by chance less than 1 time out of 20. We call that 95% certainty. So when the UN looks at, for example, the number of droughts, and this is UN language, the United Nations IPCC, they look at the number of droughts in the last 120 years. And we have droughts today, right? And they say, oh, I'll let you read it for me. Go on.
Oh, okay.
Go on. Recent. Start with recent.
Recent long-term droughts in Western North America cannot definitively be shown to lie outside the very large envelope of national precipitation variability in this region.
That means there's no trend.
Not necessarily. What I get from that is inconclusive. What I'm saying is, but these costs are impacting the communities in that part of the country in such a negative way. We've seen the wildfires, we've seen the mudslides, we've seen everything. So, this does not help solve or alleviate any of the challenges individuals are facing today.
No, but you're moving me a little too quickly. I want to go back to the statistics.
All right, I'll slow down.
As you can see, here's the chart by the United Nations and the UN. The number of droughts hasn't gone up. It kind of keeps fluctuating. It had a lot of droughts in the 1920s, 1950s, whatever. So They don't say, the UN doesn't even say, the group that's so prominent in the global warming debate, we've seen an increase in the number of droughts that we can blame on CO2. It was just as bad before the CO2. And yet, when they put out their reports, they do say droughts, wildfires, flooding, hurricanes. For each of those data that they call climate change, the report put out by the Trump administration scientists back in November, the UN itself says, in case after case with their own language, there's no trend. There hasn't increased because of CO2.
So, Dr. Rossiter, I got to ask you this.
Climate change is not extreme weather. Climate change is when you have changed the climate so it gets worse.
I think with all of these years of carbon emission and understanding that plants, which may be thriving now and do not have an endless repository to collect and absorb that CO2 in the atmosphere. So what I'm thinking of is what is going to come next and how political entities can work to combat it, because it's imminent.
Okay, I love your question. They shouldn't work to combat it because it doesn't exist. CO2 says here has
with
not.
that notion entirely.
No, this is all UN data. I'm a statistician. I only use data approved by the group that's measuring the actual studies. There has been no statistically significant increase in the droughts, in the floods, in everything that you.
But wait, whose houses are underwater, who have lost everything they want to.
But the point that he's making is that people's houses were underwater 100 years ago.
It would be the same without the CO2.
So now this is where people would show up. I mean, if we could get the Vox, HuffPo, Slate.com army to arrive here, they would all of a sudden say, what do you know about this? Are you a scientist? They throw all these questions at you. Are you paid by big oil? Any of the, just tell us all of these things.
Tell us.
Yeah, tell us, answer all of these attacks that you know that you deal with all the time, but just so we can get you on the record, because I mean, I'm sitting here, I obviously agree with you, but I need to know what the response. Oh, of course I do, because it's reality. But I need you to explain to me what's going on.
That's the only thing he agrees with me on, because I'm
he's a Democrat,
and
by
an
the way.
activist.
He's a Democrat activist.
So you love that book.
I do, well, of course.
Okay.
So, okay, but
there's so many questions on the table. Let me try to.
How do you know about this, and who's your board?
First, let me just take the first question first. How do we know that the carbon dioxide effect that is greening the planet and increasing plant productivity is going to continue? Because in here is collected all of the field experiments where they blow the level of carbon dioxide that's going to be at 600 parts per million, in about 50 years. They blow it over a field and they trap it with huge fans, and then they observe the growth of the plants. It's going to get better.
I think that benefit is going to run out and transition to negative externalities.
It's not going to in the next 50 years. That's what these studies all say. This is well-established science.
All right.
But you're right. That shouldn't be relevant. If we're going to create floods, fires, etc., then that's not enough of
Dr. Rossiter, for the people who are watching this segment, if you don't answer my questions, though, that they're going to discount everything that you're saying.
I'll answer.
Right?
I'm just trying to answer one.
I get that. The greening is a very interesting point, but why are you somebody who should be listened to on this? Who's your board?
Okay.
Are you scientists? Are you paid by big oil? We need these questions to be publicly answered.
Okay. Let's start. Are we scientists? I have a PhD in statistics. I was professor of climate statistics for 15 years at American University. That's when I flipped. When I was a Democratic staffer on the Hill, you should have seen the stuff I wrote about climate catastrophe. It sounds like the Center for American Progress, because that's all I ever heard. It was only when I was teaching and had to go back and read the studies, when my students would use claims as their papers, that I began to read into the studies and became quickly convinced. In their own words, there were no significant trends, so CO2 has not caused it. And the warming even, no matter what it's caused, hasn't caused it. Board of directors. We only have our president, who's emeritus professor of meteorology, dynamic physicist Richard Lindzen at MIT, winning all the awards. He was such a great physicist. The United Nations, the Clinton administration, put him on this UN board as the American representative. And after 4 years, he left because they were exaggerating their findings in their press releases and saying, we have climate catastrophe. So I would say our board is composed of distinguished physicists. My predecessor is Dr. Will Happer. Do you know who that is? He's the one raising the hue and cry now. He's President Trump's technology advisor, who's calling for a study, a presidential commission, of reviewing this data to make sure Americans know there hasn't been a climate catastrophe.
And what's his science background?
One of America's finest atmospheric physicists, Princeton PhD. He was the science advisor to the Bush 1 administration. These are giants in their field
See, because this is a problem. Because they always
But
say all
giants in their
all
field,
scientists
sure.
agree.
That's
And
ridiculous.
I understand this, but I'm saying this is what we're told. All
But
scientists
there's
agree.
something
They
to
obviously
note
don't agree.
that there is a massive gap between the model based on 120 years of data that doesn't necessarily apply to what we're experiencing today, doesn't account for the climate variability that is ravaging lives across the country.
But how can you take
And
action
so,
if it doesn't apply? I mean, the whole point is that they're applying it to
what
today.
I'm saying is no, this does not include the negative externalities that our people are facing right
It does.
now. It
It
merely
counts them.
highlights that over the past 20 years, carbon dioxide helped plants to flourish. Sure,
Oh, yeah, that's
but
a
there
separate
is
issue.
going to
You're right.
be a pivot and a downward
Why?
trend.
Why do you say? I know Governor Inslee believes that, but since I've got you as a student, why do you believe that? And what is your evidence when we already know that the fires, the droughts, the hurricanes, obviously those trends are flat over the last 120 years. Why do you believe CO2 caused a recent hurricane if there's no hurricane trend over the last 120 years?
I think it's merely about access to data, right? Once we have that current model tracked.
We have the data.
You mentioned data from 120 years past.
No.
the last
up
120
until
years.
today. Oh, it absolutely includes the data today. I'm saying there's no trend in floods, in global landfalls of hurricanes. It's gone down over the last 120 years. This is a terrible hurricane here in Texas, but there's been less of them. Maybe not statistically less, but it's kind of a
I mean, I
flat
think
line.
the second worst California wildfire in history was in the 1930s, which people forget when
I'm
they
just
talk
saying
about the recent
we
one
don't really
had.
see. We look for it, and we don't see a CO2 effect or a warming effect. Effect of the warming. But you're right. Let's talk about models, because that is the key of the whole debate. Everything you see that gives us reason to say we need to get rid of fossil fuels, which as a harmless byproduct emit carbon dioxide from the burning process, because we're worried about the future. And that's all modeling. The models started in about 1988 to make predictions 30 years hence. Guess what? The models predicted about 3 times the amount of warming in the world we've seen since then. So the models are running very hot. The data are telling us the carbon dioxide sensitivity, how much temperature it boosts. The UN gives a range of between 1.5 degrees to 4.5 degrees. If you doubled carbon dioxide, we're clearly on the low end. So we're not creating the climate crisis. These are the data. These are the facts. You say, am I a scientist? A scientist is someone who tests their hypothesis against the data. And the data so far do not show any catastrophic behaviors. They might in the future, and we need to monitor it, and it is very possible that some tipping point in chemistry. Just remember, most of the warming gases have nothing to do with carbon dioxide. We are at 60 degrees outside and not 0 because of water vapor, because of the water, H2O in the air.
Professor,
It's natural.
unfortunately, I have to adjourn the class because we got to go to our next segment. But it's been fun.
There's
Thank you so
much more
much.
to unpack
We
here. Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much for the
I want the
conversation.
Center for American Progress
Oh, come on. Buck's putting it out
Professor
there. We're going to have to follow up with this.
I'm going to bring
Throw it out.
I'm going to bring
Let's
the
see what you
same
got.
data for them, and they can talk.
Let's see what you
All
got. We will host that debate right here at Rising.
They won't come.
Juanita,
They won't
make it happen. I want one of their
work.
scientists. Coming up, following months of reporting about the circumstances surrounding Jared Kushner's clearance.